the story of a man and of a village. The village is a Filipino barrio inhabited by farmer folk, whose industry was matched only by the piety of their wives. This story tells of their simple pleasures, their little joys, their courtships, the laughter of their children, the marriage of their sons, the work-a-day toil, the songs of serenade. One night, disaster came to this village as it descended upon many another Filipino barrio, the coming of the Japanese. This is the story of the death of this village and of the enduring hatred of those who survived it. This is not a story of battles fought. This is not the story of the Filipino soldier in Bataan and the front lines. This is the story of a son of misfortune, a farmer turned soldier who went out to fight and came home to find grief sitting at his doorstep. This is also the story of his revenge and his death. The characters of this novel are simple folk. They think simple thoughts and say things simply. They are very close to the soil. Their loves are vast but quiet. Their hates are deathless and deep. They are representative of the Filipino, I think. This is the story of a hopeless fight in the island of Panay and of those who fell during the Filipino night.
That was from Stevan Javellana's Without Seeing the Dawn, perhaps one of the most poignant and evocative novels written about the Second World War as it happened here in Panay. While biographies and memoirs of wartime experiences abound, it is rather rare for servicemen to retell their war narratives as literary works, something which Javellana's magnum opus categorically falls.
Filipino guerrillas on Luzon, joining up with General MacArthur Jenks, taking the oath of allegiance and receiving American arms. Fighters with intense hatred for Japs, many of their comrades are already on the battlefront. The civilian situation is desperate, particularly for women and children, but they're cheerful under hardship.
Stevan Javellana was born in Iloilo in 1918. When war crept into Panay, he joined the guerrilla movement in the island. His experiences directly surfacing in his Without Seeing the Dawn.
Hope for a good working day. Hope for rain at planting time. Hope for a good harvest. Hope for prosperity and plenty. Hope for a good, industrious wife. But do not hope for war. Bravery is all right, my son. And when war comes, gird yourself for battle and fight the enemy. But never hope for war. Young men, tall and young and splendid in the light of morning, will go forth to battle with careless smiles on their faces. Not all shall return. A great many of them will be left there where they stood and fought and fell, their big bodies rotting and festering in the hot summer sun.
It was in 1947, after the aftermath of a world war that left a scarred and scared world, when Stevan Javellana published his singular novel that would be always associated with his name. It was also during this time that Javellana resumed his studies at the University of the Philippines. He earned his degree from the university's College of Law in 1948, passed the bar, and practiced law for several years before emigrating to the United States of America. The novel, being divided into two parts, have very sharp contrasts. The first part, Day, talks about life in the barrio, what it means to be a farmer. The second part talks about the hardships suffered by the villagers of that same locality. If we are to talk about special segments, perhaps, I think what is most striking is how Javellana captured the everyday practices, the customs, the little traditions that eventually build up the setting for the narrative. This was especially made prominent in the first part of the novel, Day, where he vividly describes the dances, the courtship rites, the preparations for farming, the feasts, and the festivals within his locality. So I think that would be the most significant segments from his novel.
I have delivered countless women, some of their very first babies, others of their dozen, and you may be sure I know whereof I speak. I have seen women give out their babies as easily and cleanly and swiftly as a spit. I have seen women yield the contents of their wombs only after an agony of days and weeks, some often yielding their lives as well. Believe me, son, the most loving man on earth cannot justify the pain he causes the most undeserving wife during the supreme moment of childbirth.
In the author's opening notes, Javellana points out that it is indeed representative of what the Filipinos went through during the Second World War. And if you put the literature vis-a-vis, or rather side by side, other stories and narratives written in the same genre, you will find almost the same similarities, especially on the descriptions of conflict. What makes it interesting, however, is that most of the segments, most of the scenes written in Javellana's Without Seeing the Dawn focuses more on the civilian experience during the Second World War. From the onset, during the pre-war years, which slowly led to the actual conflict and to the hardships suffered by the Filipinos during that time. What is interesting as well is that it contrasts the usual line of war literature. If you take a look at Homer or even the Song of Roland or other classical pieces of war literature, there's always the idea of marching off to battle in a sense of elation or excitement. Virgil even writes a line, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and right to die for one's country. But if you take a look at Stevan Javellana's narrative, the first part, none of that occurs. What is seen are admonitions, warnings of how war can be very terrible, and people who take part in it will just eventually regret it. So, in a sense, Stevan Javellana's novel is war literature representative of our experience, yet also special or particular to the Filipino experience, not necessarily seen in other war literature. With the American occupation during the pre-war years, the English language was the rage of Philippine literature during Javellana's time. He wrote in the time when the flowing, florid phrases of Nick Joaquin held court at Imperial Manila, and the avant-garde verses and poems of José Garcia Villa enthralled listeners and readers of New York. What is significant about Javellana's Without Seeing the Dawn is its gravitas as war literature and its exploration of the personalities involved in the story, whether as civilians or as soldiers. In his narrative of conflict, we can see glimpses of Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, or the monumental Stalingrad saga of Vasily Grossman. On the more civilian side of the narrative, we find certain kinship with Perles Bock's The Good Earth, especially in his descriptions of a farmer's life during the pre-war years.
The guests heap their plates with Valenciana, sprinkled generously with small bits of chicken meat and pork and pig's liver, raisins and halves of hard-boiled eggs. They ladled savory pancit molo and picked out fatty pieces of pork adobo. Thus sufficiently supplied, they returned to their places and ate, returning frequently to the dining room to have a second helping of the dishes that they liked best. They ate and ate until they felt like vomiting. Then they gave the leftovers to the dogs.
Okay, I'd like to answer that in two ways. First, even for contemporary readers, the novel is significant in two ways. First, it's a biography. It's biography. It's not a biography per se. It's biographical in nature. And second, the novel can be considered as a historical artifact. Let me discuss the first one. Javellana writes a disclaimer that anything written here is not essentially is fiction. Still, there is a modicum of truth, of reality to what has been experienced by the writer, which he lets surface in the narrative. So, to a certain sense, Without Seeing the Dawn can be considered as biography indirectly of Stevan Javellana. It is also worth noting that Javellana joined the guerrilla movement during the Second World War, where he fought and saw action. So, it also surfaced in the second part of his novel. Second, the novel is considered as historical artifact. What does that mean? It means that for all the little details that Javellana was able to incorporate in the storytelling, it captures the zeitgeist of the writer. It captured the times, the practices, the beliefs, even the tiny little details that eventually give color to the narrative. I'd like to point out especially one good example. There was the scene right after the dam burst, and the villagers had to salvage what they can, had to save themselves. They had very little by the time the waters reached them. And there's that very poignant scene where Carding, the main character's name, Carding's child, is being lulled to sleep. And perhaps for the first time, we read of the Hiligay ng Lullaby, Ili Ili Tulog Anay, written in English for an English novel. So that's something new. That's something not readily seen in other literatures. So, two things that make it still significant: the novel as biography and the novel as historical artifact. Stevan Javellana died in 1977 in the Philippines. His short stories have been published by the Manila Times magazine in the decades prior his demise. But it will always be Without Seeing the Dawn that he will be remembered for.